Okay, Mr. Mayor, we are live on YouTube and ready to go when you are.
Okay, great. So just go ahead and start talking, huh?
Yes, if you would like to take the
Okay,
roll.
I'm going to call this meeting of the Infrastructure Bond Engagement Steering Committee to order for Friday, February 18th. And if Kelly, would you please call the roll?
Yes. Member Gonzalez?
Here.
Member Hoy? I see him.
He's here.
He's here. And Member Stapleton is absent. And then Chair Bennett.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay.
I apologize if you were asking me a question. My audio just now started.
Oh,
Yeah.
shoot. I was just saying, are you here? And you are.
We can
here.
see you.
Perfect. I can hear you, see you, everything. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, great. Our first item of business is approval of minutes. Were there any changes anyone had? Okay, I move approval of the minutes. Kelly, you want to call the roll real quick?
Yes, sir. Did we have a second on that?
You don't need a second on it, I don't think. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, I'm hearing two things on my side. Can I have Member Hoy, please?
Hi.
Member Gonzalez?
Aye.
And Mayor Bennett?
Aye.
Thank you.
Okay, the minutes are approved. Then we'll move on to public comment. If members at all, if you'll recall, this is a subcommittee of the council that has a quorum of counselors, and we are allowing or encouraging, more than allowing, public comment during these meetings, and we'll be doing it throughout our meetings of this bond engagement committee. So I want to be sure everybody understands how this works. It will also be done with a 3-minute timeline for each of the testifiers. We will cut you off at 3 minutes and move along to the next person. We don't want to take the public's time beyond the 3-minute each of them received. So I'm going to begin with Jim Shepke. Hello, Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Committee members, I've got to share my screen here. Thank you so much. My motivation for advocating for 2 branch libraries in this bond measure really stems from this. Only 37% of our 3rd graders in Salem-Keizer schools can pass the 3rd grade reading test. And that's 10 percentage points lower than the state average. And this is a tragedy in the making, but it gets worse. And here's some elementary schools that'll be familiar to Councilors Hoy and Gonzalez. Sweegle Elementary, 82% of the 3rd graders failed the test. Hallman, 83% failed. Scott, 81% failed. Lamb, 81% failed. And you can see the distance of these schools from our public library. They're many, many miles away. And these children that fail the test, I tell you, do not use the library and are not growing up with books. So why should we care about this? Well, 3rd graders who are not proficient in reading by the end of the grade level are 4 times more likely to drop out of high school. 88% of the students who failed to earn a high school diploma were struggling readers in the 3rd grade. 85% of minors who interact with juvenile court systems are functionally illiterate, and more than 70% of inmates in our prisons cannot read above a 4th grade reading level. How could it be different? Well, here's Portland that has 15 branch libraries, one within a mile or 2 of every child in the city, and 55% of their 3rd graders can pass the 3rd grade reading test, as opposed to only 37% here in Salem. People say to me, well, Jim, we could put these in the bond measure and we could build them, but how are we going to fund them? Haven't you heard about the structural deficit that we have in the city of Salem? And my response to that is this. I don't know if you can see I think you can see that better now. If you look at what we spend on our libraries here in Salem in 2021, as compared to other major cities and counties, we are at the bottom of the list, and by far at the bottom of the list. We only spend $25.65 per capita. And if we could spend even $10 more per capita on our public library, we'd still be at the bottom of the list at $35, but we could fund those two branches. So that's what we need to do. And I'll just leave you with this picture of Salem. Most of Salem is a book desert, and we need to change that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Are there any questions for Jim? Let's see, we need to pull down the, if we could, there we go. Are there any questions for Jim? Okay. Lynn Takata.
Trying. Thank you. My name is Lynn Takata, and I live in Ward 1, and I'm the chair of Northeast Neighbors. So thank you for the opportunity to share some input. The communities in many of Salem's older tree-lined neighborhoods are experiencing a lot of challenges in people walking on our sidewalks. Many of our neighbors walk in the street to avoid falling. And unfortunately, too many people in our community have experienced some serious injuries, and some of those are lifelong, broken bones, concussions, and so on. We know the city is challenged with trying to fit so many needs into the $300 million budget. But when Mayor Bennett was our counselor, we understood that the $1 million budget per approximately $1 million budget per year, it would, using that, it would take 50 to 70 years for all of the city sidewalks to be repaired. So we're hoping the city will consider balancing the installation of new sidewalks with the replacement of some of the crumbling sidewalks, especially on routes to schools and parks. So I appreciate the opportunity to share that. Our neighborhood association also is very interested in bike lanes, which I understand are already in the budget, and on moving forward the State Street Corridor plan. So thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Lynn. Chris, did you have some questions?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have one question. Lynn, are you speaking on behalf of the Neighbor Association or on your own behalf today?
I'm speaking on behalf of the Neighborhood Association. We did a poll of our board and also a poll of the community. And the number one request from Northeast Neighbors was that, people are begging for replacement of some of our sidewalks. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any others? Thank you, Lynn, very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Lois Stark.
Hello, am I on? Okay.
You're on.
Yay. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to speak and give some input into this bond measure. I see some familiar faces, and I've worked with Councilor Hoy on the library renovation subcommittee, which was very fun. And I've known Mayor Bennett for way long, and
Then either of us will admit, Lois.
right. We were only babies at the time. So I am Lois Stark, and I am the chair of the Library Advisory Board. The lab unanimously approved a motion to urge this committee to put 1 or 2 branch libraries in this bond. And here are some of the reasons why. The new Our Salem vision and the new city strategic plan both mention branch libraries and an expansion of services. And so this is, that's visionary, and we need that kind of planning. But we need to like now put it into action. This bond is for 10 years, and in 10 years, we know our population is going to grow. So we need at least one, if not two, new branches. The bond is going to possibly have 2 new fire stations, and I know there's a question about staffing, but we'd have to staff fire stations as well as staffing the libraries. And I'm thinking that's something we could do in the 10 years that we're thinking about this bond being in place. I also think, oh gosh, 37 seconds. Okay, I think that having the library branches in the bond will help pass it. People love libraries, they trust librarians, and I think people will, but people vote for libraries, as we know, for the renovation. So let's be visionaries and let's expand library services. It's a long way if you're living in the northeast part of town to get to the library, and I think that's part of a kind of an equity piece that we need to address.
Thanks very much, Lois. Lois, I have one question. If we were to sequence 2 libraries, which would be the first you would, or which would be the one you would want to bring in first? Which part of town? What are you thinking?
Well, this is my opinion because, you know, I can't speak for the lab here, but definitely the northeast part of town. That is greatly underserved as far as public libraries. Like I said, it's a long way to get into downtown, and of course, West Salem is even farther. So I would say the northeast part of town. There are more, proportionately more people of color there. There's more people with limited financial resources. And I think that's an equity piece.
Okay. Very good. Appreciate that. Thank you. Any other questions for Lois? No? Okay. Thank you very much. Victor Dodier?
Try to
Hi,
get
Victor.
myself organized here. I am Victor Dodier. I have a background in participating in these sorts of efforts on a statewide basis. I participated as a staffer in transportation funding issues going back to the grandest crusade of all time, the 1991-93 Oregon Roads Finance Study and Oregon Transportation Plan. And I kind of finished up my career as a piece of, as working for the legislature as a staffer, working on the 2017 transportation funding package that is still being implemented. The one point that I've been looking at the various polling information that you have, one thing that I've noted is that the FAQ should provide a better understanding of the why and how this proposed bond authorization will not increase tax rates. I think I get it, but I'm a veteran of having been whacked between the eyes by bond counsel and by bond experts about how bonds work. Most people don't understand them. They look at bonds as a mortgage, and they're not that. The second point is that the public should be informed about what it is buying in the bond. That's a lesson learned from several failed statewide funding efforts. So I urge you to be as specific as you can be in selecting projects for this infrastructure funding bond or bond funding. Some aspects of the bond, the fire equipment, the fire stations, the civic center earthquake updates are specific, but the majority are not. Excuse me. In terms of where to look for projects, I would suggest that the out years of the capital improvement program would be a good place from which to select street projects. There are always projects that are awaiting funding and keep being pushed down out in time, that is. Those projects have had some level of vetting, so they would be good candidates for funding. We have a number of unfunded projects in the Parks Master Plan.
Yeah.
There are unfunded Tier 1
Thank
bike
you.
rate.
Thank you, Victor. Time's up.
Oh,
But
pardon me.
I would like to kind of pick your brain for just a sec, because I know the experience you've had in this. Were there any elements as you've looked at the bond package that just jumped out at you as, what are they thinking? Did you have any of those what are they thinking moments?
The only one that really comes to mind is the cybersecurity aspect. The reason I think that cybersecurity is absolutely essential.
Right.
If the city has not been hacked, it will be. If the city has not paid a ransom, it will in the future. That's almost inevitable. The problem is that technology changes so quickly that by the time we pay off a bond or a portion of a bond to pay for some of that infrastructure, the equipment will be obsolete. Cybersecurity is an ongoing operating expense, in my opinion.
What you mentioned the kind of the understanding of the bond strategy in terms of the retiring existing bonds being replaced by this single large bond. What aspects of that do you feel like we need to really clarify?
Well, if the city's objective is to not have the rate fall from where the level is
right, that's
today,
exactly right.
Then as you go out in the future, some of the old 2008 bonds are being retired.
Right.
I don't know what the schedule is, whether they were issued and will be retiring, let's say in 2023. But it seems like as those bonds are retired, the city should be selling some bonds in those years to basically keep the level of the rates at that. For me, I was looking at a spreadsheet I can keep of my property taxes. I know I'm probably only resident in Salem who does that. But it's about $1.20 for the Salem bonds.
Right, about 128.
And
something like that.
Well, it kind of fluctuates up and down a little bit.
Right.
And so the bonds ought to be kind of, as the old bonds are retired, the new bonds should be phasing in. And that will correspond to the development of projects, because most transportation projects don't come online tomorrow.
Right. Okay. Josh, did you have any questions for Victor on that as you looked at how you're describing it? Do you feel like you need to? He's very good at this, and I just think it's a good opportunity to kind of pick his brain a little bit.
No, I appreciate the question. I think your explanation helps a lot. We'll take a look at the FAQs and see if we can beef up that section to make it more clear what's falling off and making room for these new bonds.
Would that help, Victor, do you think? Is that what
I think it would. I think it would.
Okay, great. Appreciate that. Any other questions for Victor? No? Okay, thank you very much. I hope you'll come back again, okay, as this develops. I really appreciate you sharing your insights into this. I do.
Thank you for the opportunity to comment. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Phil Carver.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and council members, for the opportunity to comment these comments. My name is Phil Carver, for the record, and these represent 350 Salem comments. And I endorse all of the previous speakers' recommendations. It was good to hear from Victor. I haven't heard from him in a long time, and I know Lois Stark and Jim Shepke, and I appreciate all the projects and ideas that they've put forward. My point is that all projects must be consistent with the council's GHG, greenhouse gas reduction goals that have been adopted. And the first goal of those reductions is 50% reduction by 2035. And this is not possible if transportation's emissions go up. Transportation emissions are 53% of the base year emissions. The $150 million transport portion speaks of improvement of traffic flows. This is an illusion and a false thing to chase. Congestion reduction is not really possible when people can build and live farther away from their jobs, schools, and shopping. They will just continue to move away until congestion resumes the level that it was before. The focus of the transportation bonds should be on fixing roads, sidewalks, and bike and pedestrian safety and access almost exclusively. And the access would be to bus and shopping primarily, but also to schools and somewhat to jobs. In particular, we oppose any conversion of 2-lane streets to 4 lanes if the street is near a residential area. This is definitely against public safety, pedestrian safety, because you cannot put enough traffic lights in on these 4-lane roads so that people can cross safely. We also encourage using bonds in other areas like the other speakers have discussed, especially upgrading of park facilities and branch libraries so they're near neighborhoods. So this is really consistent with the number 4 strategy in the grand strategy document for the city of building great neighborhoods. And that's number 4 of 5. Number 5 of 5 is action on climate change. And so we think that these 2 priorities should guide the vast majority of the bond expenditures. And we understand there's some fire and other issues to be addressed. And I tend to support Victor's idea that cybersecurity really is an ongoing operating expense. I don't think that's a lumpy thing, maybe a replacement of a computer system. But anyway, that's not climate related. And I hope you keep everything you do focused through a climate lens. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions for Phil? All right, that's everyone signed up. Has anyone else signed up? Whoever's
Nope.
watching. Okay,
That's it.
very good. Okay, we'll go then to updates. We'll begin with Barney and Worth here.
Yes,
Yes.
this is
There's Louis. Okay.
Libby and Clark are here. And if I could just interject by saying we have quite a lot to share with you today about what we've been learning and hearing as we've been out in the community. And
Great.
I know many of the steering committee members themselves were able to participate in some of our community briefings, and they may have something to share. We're going to lead off with a summary of all the more in-depth community interviews that Barney and Worth did for us. And then we'll hear about the results of a recent poll from John Horvick of DHM.
Very good. Let me see where we're going to start with this. So where does this begin in our packet?
It is going to be on page 5. You'll
Okay.
see the community interview highlights, and that's going to be the first portion of our conversation. And then
Great.
you also have a whole set of slides, which are the findings from the survey itself.
Did you notice that some of these slides just don't work the way they're being printed? I just call your attention to that. They don't print out on the page. There's parts of the pages lost. I just mentioned that to you. May want to look at your settings on your printer.
Thank you.
Thought. You bet. Thank you. Okay. Mr. Worth.
Yeah, I'm ready to talk. I think Libby is going to show the slides here. Or
Okay, are we going to start with slides?
Here we go. As mentioned, we had an opportunity to interview community leaders here. I've lost the slides now. And can people say, I can't see the slides at all?
Yeah,
Anybody?
they're here for us.
They're there for you. Well,
Yes, they are.
I'll just talk then. We interviewed 20 community leaders last month, including all of you. We interviewed the mayor, all of the members of city council, and the city manager, interim manager, and a cross section of other community leaders, and asked for their views on several topics, including the project priorities, the amount of money that we would be asking for, election timing, and then how best to communicate with voters. And a few of the highlights, I want to recap some of the things that we heard. The first and probably the most important thing is there is no question about Salem's need for money. You know, the general understanding, appreciation that we're short of capital. We need capital to do some important things. Mostly these were described as being critical needs in the conversations. There was great appeal, as we found out with voters, great appeal to the idea of that we could raise a substantial amount of money without increasing property taxes. So that had appeal to the folks that we talked to. We also, in talking about projects, and we talked project by project, we found that they didn't all hold equal appeal. Some of the projects were of much greater interest, or the funding categories. And there is a slide there, and since I can't see the slide, I assume
I'm here. I'm on the slide with the table, table.
Yeah,
there's a slide there that shows some of the issues that were raised. Every one of the categories had at least some issues raised. One that was mentioned on cybersecurity here in the public testimony also came up. Isn't there another way that we should be funding this? That was for some of the categories that was like came up for fire engine replacement, came up for that. You know, maybe this should be something built into another part of the budget. A couple of the areas people were just a little unclear about what it was that what the project would be. What is this going to pay for? An example of that would be affordable housing and shelter. And then in some instances, people just didn't like the category or didn't feel that it would have great appeal to voters, you know, which was an issue that people were talking about, were thinking about too. Another highlight is that folks said, well, this is going to be a big, complicated measure. I'm not sure how we'll communicate it to voters. And that came up quite a bit. Folks were having trouble articulating themselves what the bond measure would be about and how they might talk to their neighbors or constituents. And so they were thinking that might be a little bit difficult to figure out a way to do that. The issue of the November election came up, and I think general acknowledgement that early is better, and that seemed like a good opportunity to put things on the ballot, but a number of questions raised about that. One of them being that it doesn't really leave enough time for public education in the view of some people who we talked to, back to that idea that this is a big, complicated ballot measure. Another issue was raised was the fact that we have the public's attention now on some other high-profile initiatives, the Climate Action Plan, for example, and maybe those things would be capturing public attention. The fact that there are several city council seats that will be open this year, that might be a distraction from the bond measure. Potential for other competition on the November ballot, although no particular measures were mentioned, just I would say more of a question. Will we have competition on the November ballot? And then the pandemic, and related or not, the voter dissatisfaction right now, the public sentiment, which really seemed to be at a low point to a lot of the folks that we interviewed. And then finally, also related to the pandemic, the idea, hey, thinking through voters' minds, there's a lot of money out there right now to pay for infrastructure. And maybe we wouldn't need that, or the voters would think we don't need bond funds because there's
Right.
just so much money around. The other, a few more highlights really have to do with the leadership of the campaign. The question being raised, when Salem's been successful with bond measures in the past, a lot of the leadership has come from outside City Hall. And a question for this bond measure, who is going to lead it? What organizations? And there on the slide are a list of some of the organizations that were mentioned as possibilities there, but no one stepped up so far, and it wasn't evident where the leadership would come from. And again, a handful of people really did say, look, I'm ready to sign on. I'm ready to help lead this thing. Just tell me what to do. So there were some people from among those we interviewed who really say they're ready to go. This is important enough. They described it as critical needs. So sign me up and I will help. And then finally, the leading messages there is actually more than one. One of them is, and the one we heard most often is stay on message. Figure out what the message is about this thing and then keep repeating that. Again, back to the big complicated measure. Let's find a simpler way to talk about this, describe it, and use that as consistently. And then the other one is just make sure that we do this through an open process and that this is seen as based on public input, that these needs arose from the public engagement that we've had in the process. So again, a quick run through of the 20 interviews. I'd say a fair amount of consistency on the points that we highlighted there. Feel free to read there's a longer version with a lot of actual quotes that we've captured there for your education there. But again, very useful to us. Now remember, this is just 20 people compared to the hundreds that John Horvick will be talking about. So we were talking to community leaders, John's talking to real voters, and a lot more of them.
Mr. Worth, one of the questions I had on that was, as you talked about sort of the structure of the bond measure, what did it seem clear for, these are community leaders, these are people who have been exposed to some extent on this. The duration of the bond measure, how bonds work through time, that you don't sell them all the first day, you know what I mean? That they kind of come through in phases, that we could be looking at 10 years, 15 years. Our last streets and bond measure, I think we're at 15 years now, just at the close of it, but it has been available to us over those years for a whole range of street related projects. Is that clear to people how that works?
I would divide the people that we talk to into two groups. One group are the people who've been working on this bond measure for the last year or two, been deeply involved, and then the others who have not. And I would say, except for the ones who have been deeply involved in this, there's not much understanding of how that would work. Again, back to the thing where this seems awfully complicated, big bond measure. I think even among community leaders, probably most of them don't grasp that.
Yeah, and it comes to mind. I understand streets over time, but I think when you mentioned is there other money or there may have been some frustration from earlier fire station opens and closures, but that we're talking about a pretty long window for the use of funds for fire stations, to the point that we're talking about really a much bigger community and really seeing experience need out in Northeast and really South Salem. Does that, I don't know, I'm just wondering if that's the kind of explanation, part of the explanation we got to figure out how to do real simply and accurately.
Yeah, I think there's appeal to the idea that we wouldn't have to be back asking again over 10 years, that as this program materializes over that 10-year period, that the city wouldn't be back again with another bond measure. There's appeal to that, but I'm not sure that whole idea of retiring bonds and I think that is going to be beyond a lot of folks in the community. I think the key thing, back to the message that I know that DHM tested and worked so well, is that you can buy all these things and your taxes won't increase. You know, we can meet these critical needs, no additional taxes. That's the appealing message there. Exactly how that happens, there was testimony on that earlier, questions raised. It's a little complicated. Josh can explain it, but by the end of the explanation, you might have more questions than you had before you started.
Right. It's finding that closure. What's the closer on that question? I mean, where do we, not where we start, but how do we put a real close on that question as to how that works? I think is probably the big trick. Not how does it work, but how do we explain it? It actually accomplishes the goals we're talking about, I guess. I also was concerned, and I don't know if this shows up in the polling information, about the assumption that somehow all this federal spending is resulting in us having just an unlimited amount of money for capital use. Is that how substantial was that problem?
You know, John probably has better thought on that, because DHM I think has been hearing that, some of that statewide.
Okay.
In Salem. So I don't think it was specifically addressed in the survey, but I think John may have other surveys that speak to that question. But we heard it, again, not just from community leaders, but I think you've been seeing it in the paper and stuff too. So
right.
John, you want to?
Yeah, I'm really concerned. We're hearing it from community leaders that they think that may be a solution to the capital problems we've got.
To some extent, they're speaking on behalf of voters, though, too.
Sure.
They're kind of imagining what voters might be thinking about.
Okay. That's a good point. Thank you.
I can just real quickly, we didn't test it in this survey, but this is John Harvard from DHM Research.
Hi, John.
I'll talk about the survey in a second, but we have tested in other surveys we've done about local funding measures and specifically bond measures across the state. It is one of the most potent arguments you can make right now against funding. And it's one of the things that you don't have to explain a lot, because it fits with sort of voters' expectations about how public dollars are spent. It doesn't have to be true, but it is powerful. It doesn't mean that it can defeat something, but just to affirm Mayor Bennett, I would expect it to be an argument used going forward, and expect it to have some purchase with voters.
Yeah, it has that feeling. Just thinking about the environment on public funding, that there is an expectation. There's an enormous amount of money available, and that it's just in the wind right now. And there's that has concerned me quite a bit. So, okay. The feds have done us no favors yet. Okay. Where do we go next?
Next, we get to hear from Don in more detail about the recent poll that was that the firm completed for us in our community about this particular bond measure and the messages.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen. One second, let me find the right document. Probably too many files open on my computer. There we go. I think I found it. So I'm going to walk through the full deck. Has some additional information, more details about some demographic differences primarily, but in the interest of time, I want to hit here on what I think are the key top line numbers. As I go through with it, please stop me if I'm not being clear. I certainly want folks to understand, and I'll do my best to be able to answer questions when we wrap up as well. I want to go to slideshow, be helpful. All right, Salem Community Improvement Bond Survey. What you'd expect, just quickly, some of the logistics here. We wanted to measure voter support for possible community improvement bond for public infrastructure. That's why we're there. Identify their priorities. So help really to inform decision makers about how to structure this. What are the priority projects, what are the priority areas to fund money or to fund, and then a little bit on messaging as well, or how to communicate about the benefits or the reasons to support this to help further communication down the road. It's a primary goal. How do we do it? Representative survey of 400 Salem registered voters. We use multiple methods to reach people nowadays. People participate, answer their phones in different ways. Some like to talk to somebody, some won't talk to somebody, and so you have to reach them other ways. And we use a process where folks get sent a text message where they can take the survey on their smartphones as well. I'm happy to talk about that method if people are interested. The important thing is to know is that we're reaching people multiple ways to ensure we have a representative sample. This was conducted middle of January, so still really fresh data. It took about 12 minutes. Importantly, this is available in both English and Spanish. We do different techniques, we set quotas to ensure that we're getting the right proportions of people in our sample that represent the community. So by age and by gender, race, area of the city, education, home ownership status, party affiliation, all those things that we know can shape how people would feel about an issue like this. We're very careful to ensure that they're represented accurately in the survey. Margin of error 4.9%. Things might not add up to 100% due to rounding in this deck here. Any quick questions about methodology can be important. All right, we're going to go through here. So as Clark was saying, voters are in a sour mood. It's just true. It's true in Salem. It's true in Portland. It's true across the state and country. We do consistently ask in the city of Salem and our work together, are things heading in the right direction? Are they off on the wrong track? You can see the green numbers there, the right direction numbers there, 18%. Just for some context, city of Portland is about 10% right now. Statewide, it's about 30% right now. It is a little unusual, historically unusual, for a city or a local government, a local entity to be lower than the state. The primary driver for voter mood at the local level is concerns around homelessness. I'd say second is around crime. Rising cost of living is also a concern too that we're picking up, and that relates to housing affordability, but it's primarily driven by concerns around homelessness and crime. That's the big issue. But as Clark was saying, if people are entering sort of a question about whether or not they want to say yes to a funding measure so their local government can spend money, like part of that they're going to be evaluating is, do they think that their government is serving their needs or not? And lots of things go into a right direction, wrong track question, but let's be clear-eyed about the fact that this is a moment of particular frustration among voters. Again, that's not unique to Salem. All right, so that's a sort of kind of big picture. One of the advantages of maybe sort of voters being in a sour mood is they see a need. And so we asked voters in the survey just to rate the quality of public infrastructure, and we defined what that meant. In the city, is it good, very good? Is it poor or very poor? And you can see that 59% say it's poor. Now, on the one hand, that's disappointing that a majority of residents or majority of voters would feel that way about their community. And on the other hand, it's clear that voters see a need. Okay, and so that part of our challenge, talking to people about the problem that needs to be fixed, well, they're there, right? They see that there is a need there. I'm not going to do a lot about demographic differences in this presentation. I'd say probably the thing to pay attention to here is the geographic differences. You do see on the right there that the poor ratings, poor or very poor ratings, were higher in West Salem and North and Northeast Salem than they were in South. There were some economic differences and some age differences. But probably the most relevant thing here is these geographic differences. And they're not huge, but they're meaningful. And something to be aware of. Also, right, do people, there's like kind of the rate and the level. So at the level, right, 59% think that things or conditions are poor, and then the rate, are they getting better, are they getting worse? 49% think that they're getting worse, 34% say that they're staying about the same, 12% better. So just to reiterate, voters see a problem, and I think that this result affirms they see urgency. And so in a perfect world, there wouldn't be a problem. But the fact that we need to go to ask them for money, we're doing making an ask about something that they feel is a need in the community. All right, we asked about the bond 3 times in the survey, sort of 4, but three primary times. The first time was with giving them very little information. So we said the Salem City Council is in the process of building a plan for the city's long-term public infrastructure needs. The survey will ask about possible community improvement bond that would fund public infrastructure in Salem. Based on what you know now, how likely or not would you be to support a bond paid by property taxes to fund public infrastructure? So we're not talking specifically about what it's going to fund. We're not talking specifically about how much it's going to cost. So just sort of getting a gut feel, right? 49% said that they'd be likely to support something like that. 27% likely. 45% say unlikely, and 12% very unlikely. So unbalanced, kind of mixed. We did do some focus groups early or late 2021, kind of matches what we heard in that research as well. So a bit ambivalent. But the very next question we asked was this. Okay, here is some additional information. Over the next 10 years, the city of Salem will finish paying off some existing debt from past bond measures. Because of this, Salem voters could approve up to $300 million in bonds to pay for infrastructure without increasing current property tax rates. So then we bump up to 60% support. 60% said they'd be likely to support a public infrastructure bond, understanding the property tax rates aren't going to increase. 60% is really the level that we're looking for. So if an issue is controversial, if it's contested in the community, if there's an opposition campaign, when those conditions exist, support tends to erode as you get closer to election day. And so when we're looking at something in the distance and thinking about its political viability, its electoral viability, we want to see a number 60% plus, because we know we might lose some support along the way. So now we're at that 60% number and we can really see the power of, hey, you're going to get some good stuff, things that you value about something that you see a need for in the community, and your property tax rates aren't going to increase, or your tax rates aren't going to increase. Okay, so that's really powerful. There's a few demos here. I think this is the last demo slide, but I wanted to show this one because we have age, income, area of the community. This is not to show differences. It's to show there is broad support, or sort of likely to support this concept across the community, whether across generations, across income levels, across geography. There's broad support. That's those two things together, that 60% threshold level, broad support across the community. These are positive signs. Okay. About the priorities. We ask about this a few different ways, and you're going to see some themes. So first, we just gave people some pretty short descriptions. Hey, is this a high priority for you in this bond measure, or a low priority for you in the bond measure? Green, higher priority, the red, lower priority, the yellow sort of in the middle. So maintain and repair existing streets, bridges, and sidewalks. We can see that that's the highest priority, and I'd say by a significant amount. 33 or 37% very high, another 36% high. So you're at what, 73% with that. Purchase land for affordable housing and shelters. Remember, I said homelessness is the #1 issue in Salem. And so that this could be accomplished doesn't surprise me that it would end up as a high priority. I'm going to come back to it though, because there's something important in this slide that I'm going to highlight in a second. But those are the top two. Build new streets and sidewalks to reduce congestion and improve safety. You're at 58%, but a pretty big drop from maintain. And then further below is replace aging fire engines and firefighting equipment. There you're at 54%. So you can see sort of a rank order there that's we're going to see again in a second. On maintain and repair versus build new, I do want to call out that there is this difference in West Salem, that there's more intensity for building new. I suspect that some of that is the bridge, that's what people are responding to. I don't know that specifically, but that'd be my intuition. Okay, with This is the same data that you just saw, but I want to call out for purchase land and affordable housing shelters, it's the second rated thing in this list. And you're at 56% saying it's a high priority. But I want to call out, because this is a theme we see throughout, is there is the strongest sort of negative response to that. You got throughout the survey, about 25 to 30% of the people are reacting negatively in the different ways we ask to purchase land for affordable housing and shelters. So you can see the very low priority is 23 for that versus say 6 for build new streets or sidewalks, or 6 for replace fire engines. It's a qualitatively different response. All right, some things that just rated lower. So these are fewer than half of voters said that these were a high priority. Upgrading security for the city's data and computer systems, upgrading parks, purchase land for future fire stations, and upgrade the civic center to meet current safety needs. And these are themes that we'll sort of see in different places too. Doesn't mean that people don't want them, but it may mean about dollars invested or communication priorities about what is emphasized. This is just a somewhat different way to get at these issues, to try to measure intensity of feeling. Here we gave people a budget. Say, hey, you got $100 to spend across these categories. You can divvy it up different ways based upon your priorities. The two things I would really call out is, again, we see street and sidewalk improvements. That's where people gave their most money. And then at the bottom, earthquake safety certainly is important, especially for those who visit and work, say the Civic Center, but it just isn't a priority in terms of voters' minds. Again, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it or that voters would be oppose the bond because of it necessarily, but it may influence dollars allocated or communications. All right, we gave people then a little bit more information about what exactly these sorts of things buy, and asked whether or not they would agree with that or not. And again, we sort of see these themes, and I'll try to move through this pretty quickly, but we gave the statement, kind of a reason that you might want to make an investment in streets and sidewalks. We said streets and sidewalks need maintenance, additional funding is necessary for traffic flow, bike and pedestrian safety, and bridge repair. And there, if you give people that little bit of information, you're at 84% say, yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that. On cybersecurity, things move up a little bit when they got a little information.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so city services rely on technology. Lessons from other cities show that we need an up-to-date, fail-safe cybersecurity. In this, we're at 78% say that that's something that they agree with. What this tells me is that unless you communicate the benefit of what people are getting with cybersecurity, it just isn't going to be an issue for them. But with a little communication, it does move people. Then you see fire engines and truck ladders, new fire stations, a little bit lower. These are the ones that tested less well, or I should say at least have stronger disagreement. Again, this investment in new permanent affordable housing and temporary shelters, a majority of people agreed with that statement, but you got 31% who disagree, including 22% strongly. That's that 25 to 30% of voters who are going to oppose that. And so it has majority support, but a pretty strong opposition. Then you can see parks, lower level priority, and the Civic Center, the lowest level priority. Now, to help with communications, we tried to give people some persuasive statements about why the bond would be a good concept. We began by just asking, hey, this idea, this concept of a $300 million bond, is this a good sort of idea or not an idea? Not so much support or oppose, but is this a good approach or not? And the question was, this proposed community improvement bond measure is different than others. Salem voters have different than what Salem voters have supported in the past. It's larger and funds more projects. The city of Salem is considering doing this because it will allow the city to make long-term plans. Long-term plans, I think, is key here, without having to go back to voters again and again. If this measure passes, the city of Salem commits to not asking voters to support another bond measure until this community improvement bond is spent down, which would be about a decade. There you got 65%. Hey, that's a good concept. Okay. That is also very consistent with what we heard in the focus groups. So there's validation between different research projects and different methodologies, that once people understand what we're trying to accomplish and why, their initial reaction is quite positive. A few things really to help more with communications. But we heard, and you'll see in a second here in the focus groups that, and with the mood, the right direction number, there is some skepticism about effectiveness of government, low levels of trust in government. And so we said, hey, to ensure that taxpayer money is spent effectively, we'll have robust oversight from independent citizen advisory board. 83% that would be a good reason to support the bond. Now I'll tell you, nobody's going to vote yes for the bond because it has oversight, but people are going to ask questions about accountability, and being able to answer them directly is going to be helpful. Importantly, the number two here thing is that this will allow Salem to make critical investments in streets, sidewalks, parks, and safety without increasing taxes, or actually increasing tax rates is what the question was. That was key. Long-term plans, you can see, also very, very effective. And again, investments in housing, a little bit lower. I'll show you this next slide here. These are the same questions again, but really highlighting the poor. Again, you got a 33%, 32% say that those investments in affordable housing are poor reasons. And then on the retest, so people had all this information. We said, hey, now that you know more, you've thought about it, you're informed, where are you at? And now we're at 65% say that they are likely to support a community improvement bond, just 33% opposed. Now we're looking at some pretty strong numbers, And just quickly at the end, why, if people said, no, I'm not going to support this, why? It is in this sort of distrust of government. And we're going to see that in an environment where right direction is 18%. Taxes, cost of living, that is an issue that's rising of concern. Those are the big things. And on the positive side, hey, we need these improvements. There's urgency. This can make our community better. It's just really those sort of broad values that we can really tap into. And with that, I will stop and be able to answer questions or just turn things back over to you.
John, were you able to measure the intensity of that 23% opposition to the affordable housing? Is that a deal killer for those people, or is that just a?
So my concern is less about a deal killer for those individuals. What I would be concerned about is that represents a group of people who may be organized in opposition. And it's these sorts of measures that are most vulnerable to an organized opposition. And that's like the yellow light for me with that funding issue and the package overall. I mean, again, most voters want to see it, but if it is something that people organize against, that's worrisome.
Would there be a way to explore that group? I mean, in polling to find out kind of what's going on there. I mean, there may be people inside that one that just, we couldn't do anything.
That's possible. And so that's a good thing for me to go look at. I will try to do some analysis of that core group and see if there's a message thing or a demographic thing that we can pull out that provides a little bit more insight into them.
Great. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thank you, John. Is there, kind of following up on the question the mayor just asked, did we try giving them more information about housing or homelessness? Like, okay, we know what works to get people off the street, getting people off the street, or homelessness has been the #1 priority for Salem residents for a number of years. Have we tried any of that, what that looks like after we give them that, maybe more information about knowing what works to help people get off the street, that kind of thing?
We didn't in the survey, so I could speak in generalities, but we're hearing in other places. And I would say, take it for what it's worth. It may not apply to Salem, it may not apply to Salem at this moment, but what we're hearing is a mood change where I'd say the last 3, 4, 5 years ago, there was more of a sense of it's housing first, it's providing social services, right? And I'd say right now, the mood and sentiment is more around, forgive me for being blunt, but personal failures, mental health, drug addiction, crime. So I don't know, but I do want to raise that flag. I think that there's been a change in how people are thinking about the issue, that we should be thoughtful going forward about how to communicate. And if there's research in the future, like that is definitely something that needs to be explored, because it's a vulnerability, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, I get a little concerned that there's a feeling left that sort of everybody left just driving to the edge of town and tell them to get out of here, and that somehow we can do that. A lack of understanding just what the environment looks like for us to operate in.
For sure.
Sounds like we have some work to do in that area. That may be one of the things we need to be, and I look forward to as you get a chance to look deeper into your numbers, but is how to talk differently or more effectively, probably, about homelessness and our response to it, and really what we're doing that is, I think, pretty successful, but there's still people sitting downtown in the park and under the Rite Aid awning, and as long as they're there, people think nothing's happening. So it's how do we explain that?
Unless just I do want to take a step back and say, like, overall, this is a vulnerability, but overall, these are more positive results than I expected going in. And I do want to communicate that to you, like, right? Like, we see that 65% number at the end. We see movement in a positive direction throughout the survey. There are several strong messages to move forward. It's clear that people see that there's a need and urgency, and like they get these benefits without increasing the property tax rates. That's a lot of positive stuff. And also there's this yellow kind of this thing we got to attend to as well. But the overall big picture, I want you to hear, these are fairly positive results, and I would say better than I would have thought going in.
One other, and it may not be anything you can talk about from your results right now, but just maybe your experience. I am concerned about other issues that are going to be filling the discussion, and whether it's climate change, our Salem, the other things we need to be working on. What do they do to those numbers? Do they cause us to lose people? I'm mad at you. You're going to take away my lawnmower. I'm going to vote against your $300 million bond. You know what I mean? It's that kind of.
Yeah, I don't know for sure. And I should also be clear about, even though I'm pretty bullish about these results, we didn't test opposition messages. So we didn't try to understand how people might be pushed in a negative direction. And it, review the results with that context too. I do think, just to reiterate, this is a need that people see. They see urgency around it. They get to see a benefit that they get to have without their taxes. And like, there are some clear sort of things like, communicate about the benefits of transportation. Like, that's number one. You can move people on cybersecurity. That's important. Like, if you do something with parks, that's great, but your messaging is going to be more targeted to those neighborhoods that are going to get those parks, and probably less a broad message because it just wasn't the priority for other folks. Like, there are some real lessons in there. And then, further exploration would be see how robust this support is against counter messages, which we just didn't do here.
Looking at that, then, how, as you described, kind of breaking up the electorate to the neighbor, how granular are we going to have to get to achieve the kind of improved results you showed us in terms of sharing it? How do we have to go down to a certain level, like the messages will have to be neighborhood specific? The messages.
No, I don't know if neighbors. I mean, certainly Clark and Libby weigh in. I don't know if the messages, like, there's big, broad, high level messages I think are going to work across the community. Like, and then, like, on top of that, when you can talk about specific projects, when you're going to the neighborhood association and be delivered in that community, like, and on top of it, but I do think that sort of like transportation is a big deal in the community, right? That's no matter what part of the city you're on. Like, there's this kind of opposition around affordable housing, but affordable housing and homelessness is an issue across the community. So those sorts of things are going to work broadly. And then you have an opportunity, I think, to talk about specific projects when you're meeting with those specific groups.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I respond on the granular. For Keep Salem Moving, we found that was critically important to show projects in individual areas. And so
Okay.
at that time, council members went around to each of the neighborhood associations and basically showed them what they get for that investment. And that proved to be an important part of the program. That same approach worked in Bend and also worked in Tualatin on transportation. Now, it doesn't work for everything,
Right.
but transportation, it proved to be critically important, not just the kinds of projects, but exactly what projects, where they'd be located. Parks might be another example of the same kind of thing.
Right. Right. Okay. Did you get any, and I don't know if this was in a part that you didn't show us or anything, but best spokesman type?
We didn't test messengers in this survey.
Okay.
You know, the typical ones I would expect to be would be, you know, your small business folks, and they always test really well. We
Right.
didn't ask about the fire chief, but fire chiefs tend to test very well. Public safety officers do. I think your neighborhood association people are going to be, you know, people who, you know individually and trust. It's going to be, you know, things in those sorts of lanes. I doubt we're going to find uniquely different sorts of messengers for
Okay.
Salem. Although I would keep an open that as a possibility. You might know people, you might know entities, and we should consider testing that later. But I would, again, Clark and Libby, please weigh in if you have thoughts around it. But the typical messengers I suspect would work here as well.
Okay.
We have started to think about that a little bit because of the diversity among the categories here. So if you realize if you're talking about cybersecurity, that's probably a different person than if you're talking about fire engines.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Any questions from anybody? Jose, anything? Oh, Steve, go ahead. Steve, Chris, I apologize. Jeez.
Sorry.
Where I got Steve, I don't know.
I don't know. I've been called a lot of things, but I think that's the first
Yeah,
time.
that ain't it.
Yeah. So I don't think so. This was very helpful. I think it was very enlightening, and I'm looking forward to maybe. I don't know what our plan is for further polling, but I look forward to some further refinement at some point.
We do have a plan for a future poll after we know what we're including in the measure.
Okay.
That's what I think is going to be key. And I think that people are waiting for, at least my experience when I've been at Courtney's presentations, is they have a little bit of a difficult time conceptualizing what we're asking them. And they really just want to know, okay, what's the plan? And then we'll let you know what we think.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I think that's going to be really interesting, is how to frame this and frame it inside of a 10 to 15 year life cycle and how it plays out. And I was really interested in the comments about cybersecurity that we heard from the public comments today. Sort of a changing, you always have this changing cyber ecosystem that you're trying to keep up with. How does that work? How do we explain that in terms of what success from investment looks like? What's that look like?
And the other thing I would like to explore more is, so what now that we're getting input on some from the community, that maybe adding some things to our potential list, is how do those play, like libraries, for instance?
Oh yeah.
We didn't factor that into any of the polling. So what does that mean in terms of perception?
Yeah, I think that's really important to understand, because I think that the conventional wisdom, certainly the way I've always felt about it, is libraries are very popular. Librarians are very trustworthy, as we heard today, but I've never seen it tested. And it would be interesting to see what that looks like. I don't think there's any question about the love of libraries, but what does that look like? And should we even ask about libraries branch libraries in a different configuration than stacks in a librarian? Is there a different way to talk about libraries that might help in terms of the discussion? It's not just brick and mortar and someone shushing you. It's more complex than that.
I don't know how it would test here. I don't know how it would affect the overall sort of support.
I don't think it worked. It's not
I would just say you might want to reach out to the Multnomah County Library System. They passed a large bond measure in 2020 and sort of wrestled with some of those issues, and they might have some insights about that.
Okay. That's an interesting. Yeah, there is quite a bit really from that library polling. I'll bet that would be interesting to look at. Okay. Josh, do you want to say something?
No, just on for the next thing.
Okay, what's next?
We're going to talk about the CIP process and scoring criteria.
Okay, go ahead.
Great, I'll share my screen.
Josh, would you mind just leading off with we're being responsive to the request from the last meeting, and we have some proposals that make this relevant for the purpose of the bond selection?
Yeah, that's correct. Thanks.
This is not just an overview of how CIP works. It's really how would this apply? Let's assume that we have some understanding of it.
So this is a truncated version of the long presentation that we do and how the bond might fit in the same process, similar process. Similar to the current bond initiative, the first step of the CIP is to identify projects. That's what we're spending a lot of time right now. Courtney's gone to almost all the neighborhood associations, Courtney.
Okay.
Yes, I believe that's true. Plus, just in terms of how we're sourcing, if I might, just a moment, Josh, we're doing that crowdsourcing, that neighborhood briefing, community briefing to get project ideas. We are pulling from the existing planning efforts that have resulted in parks master plans, transportation system master plan, CIP. So we're pulling from those project lists as well. We're in consultation with transit about some of their ADA specific needs that, our sidewalk improvements could benefit them as well. And then we have some work we're doing with the school district to identify projects for safe routes to schools that may exceed available funding on their side. Also, again, mutual benefit. So that's where we're sourcing these project lists that we will put through this criteria, a little bit of modifications with which Josh will give us.
Thanks, Courtney. In addition, Public Works also has a practice of meeting with each infrastructure group regularly throughout the year. They meet with the operators and managers and really hear what's going on the ground. Once the projects are identified, most projects are scored by staff against the CIP criteria listed on your screen. The criteria does vary between infrastructure groups slightly. Transportation looks a little different than SDCs, utilities, or parks. For the bond criteria, we're looking at adding additional criteria to what you see on the screen for the climate impact, additional equity besides Title VI, safe routes, sidewalk improvements, bike lanes, street trees, and ADA benefits. And some of those are just yes or no recognitions. It'll be a checkbox if it adds sidewalks or bike lanes, things like that.
Your social and geographic equity, would you call that your equity lens? I mean, is that what that is? And if so, can we get a look at that?
Good question. This is really related to Title VI, the one you see on your screen. So when you're talking about the equity lens is what we're looking to add to this criteria for the bond.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's just going to be essential that we have a robust equity lens on this to make sure we know what we're doing, because I think we'll be asked, and I think correctly so.
That's great. We'll make sure we have that listed out.
Okay.
I'm assuming you're going to want to see the criteria, in the various scales.
Yeah, I think as we start to understand projects, whether it's large or small, however you're going to break this thing up to in digestible bits, I think understanding how it fits in with these criteria at least examples so we can understand how to apply these criteria to individual projects. I don't know I just don't know how deep you're going to go into a long-term bond measure, figuring out what each element looks like under this adopted set of criteria. So
Sure, we could do a deep dive on a couple examples to really show
that'd be great.
how it applies. Yes.
I think that
And
helps.
Josh,
They don't have to be wildly complicated. I'd like to see a dive on the cybersecurity. I think that would be very helpful to have to see how you take this kind of information and explain why cybersecurity is as essential enough to be called out to the level it is.
Understood. Yes, of course.
Okay, it's just a thought. I'm not,
No, that's a good thought. Yeah, we could definitely do that. So moving forward, after you have all the criteria scored, they get programmed. This is a complex process, and Public Works has some excellent staff that do this on an annual basis for the CIP. But it's really balancing the funding, the timing of projects, looking at the scores, making sure you have it all lined out. And I'd like to note as for the CIP, and we could consider something like this for the bond also. It's a program funding. It's more like a bucket of money for a certain category. For example, down here you have fire hydrant upgrade program. We don't identify the individual fire hydrants. We just allocate funds for that program. So it's not scored. It's an ongoing program, and it is just used to program those funds in the construction fund.
do you view this scoring matrix or whatever I would call this, but do you view this as giving you giving the public or us the kind of information we need, sort of longitudinal look at how the spending of this money will occur in terms of its longevity? Do you see what I'm thinking? Is kind of how do you decide 10 years out that we'll be spending this much, or do you do it that way? How would that work with this? Because I think the thing that makes this work is that we have a plan that carries over at least 10 years, because we're not going back out for more money, that we'll need to kind of have a way of demonstrating how that works, I think.
Yeah, excellent point, Mr. Mayor. So after we gather the projects, what we can do is we can plan those 10 years of projects. It'll be a little different than the CIP, a longer time frame. But what we have to do is to know when those projects land, when we can get them completed, to make sure we can issue bonds to match the timing and the spend down requirements.
Okay.
And
Good.
if I could just interject for a minute, I think too, smarter brains than mine are good at forecasting when something would need to be designed in order to be constructed in an out year. And sort of the way I think about it is, in the last Streets and Bridges bond, the Glen Creek intersection project was superbly complicated. And so the brains in our engineering group said, well, if we want to build it as late as possible so that we have all of it designed and all of the acquisition and all of that, then we could put it out in the bond package at this time, right? So the timing of, and that gets back to the, I think the testimony earlier, Victor's testimony about how and when we stage what projects for which issuance. And so we will have to have that level of detail worked out. But in terms of what we present and how the scores are done, I think Josh, what we're looking at right here is that composite score is going to be what we would have as a result after running a project through the CIP scoring criteria. But then we also want to have a way so that the steering committee, and then subsequently the council and subsequently the community, would have a sense of knowing when a project results in a street upgrade, a sidewalk upgrade, adds street trees, adds bike lanes, improves ADA. We're going to try to have a presentation view that allows the reader to see immediately what other benefit is secured, not just the scoring criteria, but whether or how there's a climate impact, whether or how there's an equity benefit, that kind of thing, just more visually at the ready, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's really good. What we're building, I think, in this is a demonstration that says to the public, have confidence. We are planning on how to use this money. This isn't like 300 million bucks that's going to get just tossed out over time. It actually has a programmed set of both decisions and need and evaluation, and and all the rest of it behind it. And we're thinking of that as we put this together. I think that's real important. It's that level of confidence we'll need to have when you're asking for a 10-year bond and you're never coming back, during that period. It's a tremendous challenge to package that kind of program up. So I think it'll be quite interesting to see how you do it. But with your new title, Josh, congratulations. You'll have no problem putting it together.
Thank you. I hope so. Right now, we're looking at just a little preview. We're looking at 3 issuances. This could change depending on the projects and how they really line out timing wise, but $100 million issuances, one every 3 years. So one initially after the bonds passed, one 3 years later, and then another 3 years later. And that really does speak to what Courtney's talking about with the phasing. So you can have the design work done ahead of time, and then the funds come in just in time for that construction. Because we don't want funds sitting there. We want them completing projects. So it's really that just in time funding that we need.
Great.
Couple more slides. I know you guys are familiar with this, but just to reiterate it, all those scored projects, they're aligned with the available funding from the various buckets. You know that we can't use funds for anything. There are certain restrictions like lodging taxes, utility rates, grants, URA. What we're talking about for the bond is in this bottom left category, geo bonds. They come with their own set of restrictions. And there also could be other funding involved depending on the project. So just that funding coordination is a big conversation moving forward.
The other part of that, I think that is going to be the difficult one, is geo bonds and general fund, how they're going to interact, because any number of projects can have an ongoing cost associated with them, whether it's opening a fire station or a branch library or a park. They have operational costs that affect the general fund. So finding that happy medium on those is going to be the challenge, like Mr. Shepke kind of outlined with the libraries. So
you're absolutely right, Mr. Mayor. It will be a challenge, and it is one of the scoring criteria. So it is something we'll be looking at. What is the ongoing operating costs? The nice thing is some of these projects will reduce costs. Newer buildings increase efficiencies. And as you repair things, the operating costs do go down in some cases, but like a branch library or fire station, there are operating costs that go along with it.
I don't want anyone to ever think that we can go to the Urban Renewal Agency to pay for those operating costs, but I hear that a lot, is how come you can't just give it a grant, or, how about all that money over there, that kind of thing. So that's always a challenge, I know.
Yes, it is. Moving forward, you're familiar with this, the CIP. This display should be familiar. It contains all projects with identified funding, the cost of 50,000 or more, and those projects with new funding. So if the bond passes, the bond projects would be in the CIP also. We'd lay it out for 5 years. In this case, we'd have another 5 years afterwards to line up those projects. And then after the CIP is the public hearing, those projects flow into the proposed budget along with all the other items, the carryovers, reappropriations, the smaller projects, administrative costs, and the remaining 4 years of the CIP are used as a starting point for the next year planning and budgeting process. And that's my last slide, so I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Anybody? Very good, Josh. Thank you very much. I'm sure as this develops, we will have more questions and suggestions for you. Really appreciate you guys sharing that much. That was really a lot of very good information. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, what next, Courtney?
So for our next step, we're going to be bringing you in at your March 18th meeting. We're going to be bringing you the list of projects that we've been gathering through all of this outreach engagement and some of the other sources that we referenced. And we'll be running it through the scoring criteria for you and making a presentation about that, identifying those projects that might give us an extra benefit for our community. And then we'll be hoping to be able to make some decisions in that meeting and identify projects that are definitely in, projects that may be on a bubble, depending on how much they end up costing. There's going to be some additional estimating that our folks in engineering will need to do just given the time frame. And then we would like to leave the March meeting, if possible, with a general recommendation for how the funds that 300 million might be spread around the different project types, and maybe some key projects that we're going to include. We would like to then take that to the council for approval, and that starts our whole new round of messaging. So that's the March 18th meeting. And then we're looking to schedule you again to come together April 15th. It would be in our normal Friday cadence about this same time, if that works for most of the members. I'm seeing some nodding, great. And so that's our next step moving forward. We'll have for you, when we next get together, more information. Libby and Clark from Barney and Worth have been engaging other communities that have done similar kinds of measures to get a sense of what tends to work best and what things to avoid. So we'll have that input for you as well when we next get together.
Could you, that sounds great. That'll be a really interesting meeting. Could you be sure to include the branch libraries, however you want to bring them to us, but you may want to talk with the librarians or with Jim or with Lois or whomever, but I think there is some interest, always interest in branch libraries. I think that's whether we can do it or not is a whole different discussion, but I think it's important that we get some good look at it as part of the potential project list.
Yes, we will have a cost estimate for that.
Good, and an ongoing, I think the operational estimate or a configuration, maybe you could just look around quickly or have someone look around quickly and see if there are alternatives to the traditional, I don't know, and I don't know what that is. I'll be honest, we have no idea. I don't know, maybe it's like Redbox, I don't know. But it's, how do you do it? Are there other alternatives that would at least get books out into those areas of town there where there's a feeling that we're not there? And we're not. The other would be if there are any specific parks projects, would that be part of what you're doing, looking at, I don't know if there's some that are in the works now that we don't know about or haven't seen yet, but I think that would be helpful to just understand if there are and what they are generally, what's out there, including any kind of neighborhood or pocket or other kind of park configuration we haven't seen before.
We do have, I'm just checking your packet. It's beginning on page 62. You'll see some sidewalk ideas,
oh, great.
some safety ideas, bike lanes, and then there's a whole bunch of park improvement ideas beginning on page 65.
On page 65, and that's what you gave us today?
Yes, and this mirrors some input. So this is the segment of input since we last got together. There were there is another list of projects that we're pulling from our last meeting. But you'll start to see some interest in smaller micro parks that might get to your idea of an alternate way of delivery. And then there's some emphasis on sport courts, and then a bunch of other wonderful ideas for parks improvements. So those are featured in your summary, and this is unedited input. We have, I think, about 290 different ideas that have come in through our online tool.
Right.
And that's what I'm showing here.
That's
and
in
then
that section that shows up on page 56 and goes on from there. Is that, do I
Yes.
understand that sort of gives a whole bunch of ideas?
Yes, organic
Well,
input.
pick out some ones you think are worth going. I don't know how else to describe. Do you want us to? But what's here that we ought to be putting into more depth discussion? You know what I mean?
We'll be doing that for you. Some of these
Great.
project ideas are more discrete and easier to estimate. And
Okay.
others are general, sort of to your question, general ideas for a different approach to park improvements and that kind of thing. And so we'll be doing some estimating and running those through the scoring tool.
Okay.
and getting that to you for the March meeting.
And for that too, could those of us, at least those of us on the committee, if we go through that and we see something we're interested in, just fire that off to you?
Oh,
Sort of,
certainly.
hey, look at this one,
We are going to be looking at all the ideas that are coming in, but certainly as I've been making my rounds, we are getting input from counselors as
clear.
well
Okay.
as neighborhoods. Yeah, we're getting input from everyone. So it's
Okay,
great.
sounds good. Anything else, Chris? Anything? Okay. Jose, anything?
No,
Very
all
good. So we're going to
information.
meet
Thank you,
again.
Mayor.
Oops, I'm sorry, Chris.
No further questions, Mayor. Thank you.
Okay, great. So one more time, we're meeting again when?
On March 18th, please. And
Okay.
that's the big conversation about projects and the size and shape and scope of the bond.
And is that a particularly good time for public to weigh in?
Oh, certainly.
Good.
Certainly.
Okay.
And
Okay.
always.
Always. Very good. Okay, well then, if there's no further business, and it doesn't sound like there is, we're adjourned.